Hi everybody, my name is Fred Warner and you're watching Future Engineering Bets. So today we're going to be looking at a very interesting topic in the automotive space, in the electrification space, really around automotive OEMs, and the question mark and the title of today is, have they lost control of their own market? The brutal reality is that the legacy OEMs have lost the leverage they've held for the last 50 to 100 years. If the value in automotive has migrated to the supply chain, the battery, the software, the tech, the integration, which the OEMs don't own anymore, why would the dominant players of the industry want to be pushing for high volumes and low margins? You could argue, and I think a lot of people will, if you don't have the powertrain, which we've talked about, and you don't have the software, you're really just a mechanical integrator bolting the bits together at the end. Where's the true value in that going forwards? If OEMs are handing billions of pounds over to startups to solve their software challenges, then it suggests they're not in a good place. Hi everybody, my name is Fred Warner and you're watching Future Engineering Bets, where we look at the future of product innovation, where capital outlay meets product development, meets R&D and the consumer's choices. So today we're going to be looking at a very interesting topic in the automotive space, in the electrification space, really around automotive OEMs, and the question mark and the title of today is, have they lost control of their own market? So for over a century, OEMs have been at the top of the food chain. They're the ones that have held the innovation. They're the ones that have held the consumer and the brand. But things are changing, and they're changing rapidly, particularly with the onset of new regulations and the shift towards EV and electrified vehicles. But what does that mean for the world's automotive OEM companies? Maybe we should be asking ourselves, whereas the OEMs were the giants and the innovation leaders of the past, are they merely the assembly plants of the battery EV companies and software providers of the future? Will they be just the brand? So we're going to divide this into a few sections, and part one is going to be the powertrain problem. So the automotive industry has relied in the past on the internal combustion engine, as you well know, and the European and the American OEMs in particular have been very strong in this area, along with the Japanese companies. And people have been coming into that market. You know, the South Koreans have got some fantastic products now, and other countries come in. But going forwards into the new generation of vehicles, the battery componentry is the single most expensive part of an EV. And OEMs don't own it. Whereas in the past, OEMs would have their own internal combustion engine platforms, or they would share them with each other, they don't own them anymore. OEMs are now forced to rely on a few significant battery specialists in the automotive market. One of those being BYD. You've heard the name on the cars, but they're also a huge supplier of the battery tech. The challenge for the OEMs is that by not owning all of your own battery tech, you're being pushed into both scheduling and costing, driven by your supply chain in a way they weren't in the past. Now, it's not straightforward because the whole battery supply chain has been built in China over a significant period of time at a very strategic level, at a national government level, whereas in Europe, there's no joined up thinking. It's companies operate for themselves, the legislators push them into certain places to make them do what they want, and that lack of overarching strategy has left Europe and America way behind, but it's particularly affecting Europe as they move towards the electrification at a higher pace. So as the European companies have tried to set up their own battery companies, their own battery supply chain, it's been struggling. Volvo is one example. Northvolt failed to meet contractual obligations and stopped financing joint ventures. And Volvo took full control of Novo Energy, but then couldn't find a partner to run it and has put it into hibernation. So you take an example such as the automotive sales company backed by Mercedes and Stellantis. They had to slow down production of cells because of the cost, trying to chase the Chinese success story. The next big thing is the software trap. Historically, OEMs would buy their ECUs from suppliers and they would load them with some software, enough software to run the car and through the various communication systems. But cars are changing. Cars are becoming fully software-driven vehicles. That means that you're defining the vehicle around the software as much as you're doing anything else. In the past, software was a bolt-on to run the vehicle. Now it's becoming the core of the vehicle. So today's software-defined vehicles require a central computing power and architecture. They need over-the-air update capability. They need to be able to monitor and change things within the vehicle. And it's ending up with modern cars having often quoted over 100 million lines of code running in them. It also makes cars very complicated, where a car it can communicate with its own headlights and its own tail lights and every aspect of the car. To then replace a headlight becomes a very expensive exercise versus a traditional headlight where it was just a dumb headlight. So VW tried this and they've not done so well. Their software unit Cariad failed and delayed a major Porsche and Audi launches. VW has entered a massive 5.8 billion joint venture project with Rivian just to license their software stack and their zonal architecture, which is basically saying they don't have the expertise in Volkswagen to build their software cars of the future, as do many of the OEMs not, other than probably Tesla, who have set out for being a software-defined vehicle from the beginning. So when a software platform or a startup company is the one helping OEMs out of the place they're in, what is it that OEMs are now really bringing to the table? You could argue, and I think a lot of people will, if you don't have the powertrain, which we've talked about, and you don't have the software, you're really just a mechanical integrator bolting the bits together at the end. Where's the true value in that going forwards? And that's what we're going to see struggling in Europe in particular. Next up, we come up to the Chinese dominance of the ecosystem, the supply chain around all of this. Traditionally, Europe wasn't overly dependent on the Chinese supply chain for the automotive cars. Not to say things didn't come from China, but the move to electrification has seen a massive shift in reliance on China, who have set up, as we said, for particularly the battery tech. And they're also pushing very hard into cars in the software side, defining vehicles. And if you watch the Chinese market closely, they have way too many car companies. They have so many car companies popping up everywhere all of the time. They are really pushing. Now, a lot of those won't survive in the long run, but the future big players are already starting to emerge. You've got BYD, you've got Chery, you've got Geely, you've got so many big Chinese companies. And by controlling the ecosystem around that, they can ultimately dictate to everybody else how it plays out. So China have the raw materials, the rare earth processing, and cell manufacturing required to create an EV, with the battery being the most expensive part. We've got an overcapacity threat that I've talked about before. We are making more than the world needs. And they say that China has about 2.5 times overcapacity than the actual transition to electrification requires. So if you think that China has 2.5 times more capacity than is needed for the electrification transition to EVs, and that doesn't include the rest of the world. And if China can undercut everybody, where does that leave the rest of the world? So the automotive companies are now looking to Chinese companies to make partnerships because they have to. So an example, Stellantis has a joint venture with China's Leap Motor to import platforms and run completely knocked down assembly lines just to try and keep its budget cars competitive. Now, this is the first step of cars really coming from China, and Stellantis ending up being a brand. And if you don't know, Stellantis owns Fiat, Maserati, Vauxhall, to name but a few of the brands that they currently operate in Europe. Now, the next power play is who owns the IP. Whereas traditionally OEMs had the IP and suppliers would supply to them, the tier ones, and particularly we're talking about the Chinese companies, they're going to own a lot more of the IP in the future, which really leads to that argument that OEMs are going to end up being an assembly brand that could be owned by anybody, and the assembly lines will probably be greatly simplified. So we seem to have a world where tech giants, if we look at America, you can't really argue that the companies are colossal, and they're going to own a lot of the IP. You've got China owns the battery and the tech, and will also own the software and the tech in the future. So the real IP ownership is moving into the tier ones and into the supply chain, leaving the OEMs a bit high and dry on IP in the future. So I think 3 questions to really ask is, who owns the customer? If a driver interacts with the software in a car and they're really interacting with an Apple CarPlay or an Android Auto or the in-car software, you're really interacting with that software company predominantly. There's obviously other software powering the vehicle itself, which one company could do many automotive companies. The same software powering a Tesla could be powering a Volkswagen, could be powering a BMW in the future. Does the badge on the steering wheel matter that much in the future compared to the past, when the battery tech's coming from China, the software is coming from the tech giants, and really the difference is the badge on the steering wheel, the colour of the seats. This next question is who captures the profit? In a world where the tier ones have more control and they're taking profit with the powertrain and the software and all of the tech before it gets into final assembly, how much margin will there be left in final assembly of vehicles in the future? Whereas the OEM would have taken the majority of that margin through the supply chain may end up being the ones taking the majority of that margin. And this OEM is the one that's going to be squeezed and squeezed and squeezed on the margin in the end, which puts the OEM in a more awkward position. And biggest question is, will tomorrow's automotive companies even build cars? Now, we've not even talked about self-driving cars and automated fleets of the future, which you know and have heard about and will no doubt come to pass. If the value in automotive has migrated to the supply chain, the battery, the software, the tech, the integration, which the OEMs don't own anymore, why would the dominant players of the industry want to be pushing for high volumes and low margins? Where does that leave them? Now, we're ignoring the very premium products that are aimed at more niche buyers. And let's say there will always be an element of sports cars and prestige cars. The general day-to-day car becomes very much a commodity item. And if the Chinese can make commodity items at a decent price, where does that leave automotive companies in the future? Stellantis, particularly with its range of mid-price cars, is especially vulnerable to them. Why would they keep on running low-margin factories indefinitely? They'll have to look at their business model and say, where is the value that they can add, and reorganize and transform their business model appropriately. In the end, will it literally be all the cars are made in China and all of the brands are either owned by the Chinese companies, or you put them into Europe and you slap a badge on it and one person's buying a Ford, one person's buying a whatever, but really they're all the same car underneath. So to sum up, the brutal reality is that the legacy OEMs have lost the leverage they've held for the last 50 to 100 years. The legislation pushing people into EV and electrification, particularly in Europe, has opened the doors at the right time for the Chinese to flood the market with their products. So the legislators have, in fact, timing-wise, helped the Chinese take the automotive companies' pie, and with that, the jobs and security and the profitability and the wealth that comes from having your own automotive companies. Automotive OEMs are trapped between Chinese monopoly on the EV supply chain and a Silicon Valley monopoly on tech. If OEMs are handing billions of pounds over to startups to solve their software challenges, then it suggests they're not in a good place. So are the OEMs still in control of the automotive industry? I'd say no. And you could liken it, very crudely this is, to even things like the music industry, when first downloads came along and then streaming came along, and it left the music industry totally changed forever, because now the tech companies are the ones taking all the money out of the music industry, not the artists, and not even so much the record labels. Well, the future of the automotive is that the OEMs, the automotive companies, won't be taking the money out of the industry. The battery makers and the software and tech companies will be taking the money out of cars too. So if you were a betting man, you would be betting on the tier ones, on the software companies, you would be betting on the battery companies, particularly the Chinese ones, where they already have the ecosystem around the manufacture. It's hard to bet on middle market European and UK automotive manufacturers and Japanese ones, because it doesn't look like there's much room for them in the future. The ones that will probably survive will be the premium ones, but even that isn't guaranteed when next the Chinese will make the premium cars, and already are. And when they can tick all the boxes of what's required, it could really dent the prestige companies too. So, difficult times, challenging times for European and UK OEMs. And to answer the question I asked you originally, have the automotive OEMs lost control of their own market? I would say the answer is conclusively yes, and the landscape is going to significantly change over the future, and mechanical integration and assembly of cars is going to be a pretty straightforward exercise. You've been watching Future Engineering Bets. I'm Fred Warner. Thank you for listening. Do like and share, do follow, listen out for the next one, and if you've got any comments, please let me know.